So the last of these conversations about sort of international relations history is going to focus on the unipolar moment. And this is sort of the last 30 years or so. So I'm not sure if it quite counts as history, but I think it's an important process to sort of think about, both in its own right being important because it's the chunk of the international system that we've lived through, but also because it highlights some of the concepts we're going to be talking about later in the semester. So the unipolar moment is this period that occurs after the Soviet Union collapses, right? Where the United States is left as the only superpower that exists. The Soviet Union is broken apart. It goes through economic crisis to the point where by the mid 1990s, the Russian economy is roughly the size of Pennsylvania's economy. The United States remains, however, in control of this very powerful, wide-ranging alliance network that was created during the Cold War. The United States is in a dominant or position to control all the major global institutions, whether it's the United Nations, where the U.S. has financial influence and a veto, whether it's the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, where again the United States has financial influence or strong leadership position. And the United States is military dominance globally continues to grow throughout the 1990s. And so this idea of a unipolar system with one powerful state rather than a bipolar system like we had during the Cold War, where we had two countries that were in rivalry, is really an unusual thing. Historically, there have been processes that have prevented other countries from reaching that level of global dominance. And there's widespread speculation that it can't last. And we'll talk about two processes that might check that kind of situation. So when we talk about the unipolar moment, it sort of implies that this is a really aberrant situation and it just won't be able to last long term. One of the processes that oftentimes undercuts countries that have sort of an overwhelming lead compared to peer competitors is this idea of imperial overstretch. And this is something that Paul Kennedy has talked about in his book. The basic idea is that powerful states oftentimes fall victim to this sort of dynamic where they assume that because they're powerful, they can do more or less whatever they want, and they overestimate their ability and they underestimate the cost, and as a result, take on this sort of grand plans to remake things, to alter the international system, and they exhaust themselves in tackling these hugely complex security and political problems. As a result, they end up pouring more and more resources into their military. As they pour more resources into their military, that allows less resources for investment into their domestic economy. And without the investment into the domestic economy, the foundation of sort of economic power and military power starts waning and the country goes into decline. And so the response to the United States to September 11th might, on one level, kind of look like that pattern, where the United States is sort of plodding along, and then after September 11th embarks on this global war on terror, involving invasion of multiple different countries, and wide-ranging commitments to stamp out Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations wherever they might be. The U.S. military spending did go up during the global war on terror in the 2000s into the 2010s, and the global economic crisis, the Great Recession, also kind of fits that pattern, right? That the United States is pouring money into these military campaigns. Meanwhile, the global economy and the U.S. economy are collapsing. But I think that's probably a little bit oversold. And I'll give you an example where we have seen, I think, imperial overstretch play out, and that's with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union tackles this global campaign of spreading communism international. It's propping up these regimes in Eastern Europe and trying to maintain favorable trade ties with countries like India and elsewhere, and really is just exhausting itself economically. Competing with the United States in the new military modernization is expensive, and as a result, by the time the Soviet Union collapses, the Soviet Union is spending 50% of its GDP, 50% of everything it produces on its military and its foreign policy apparatus. And as a result, it's incredibly underinvested in its infrastructure. And so there are roads leading into Moscow that just aren't being paved as a result of money just not being available for that sort of a thing. So that's what we tend to think about when we think about imperial overstretch. The U.S. sort of military investment we saw after September 11th pushed U.S. spending on its military from GDP of about 3% up to 4, 5, 6, or 7%, depending on the year. While that's higher, historically, I'm not sure that that's crazy. It's certainly nowhere near the 50% that the Soviet Union was spending. During World War II, the United States spent roughly 25% of its GDP on its military. During Vietnam, the U.S. was spending 10 to 12% of its GDP on its military. So the level of spending that the United States was investing in maintaining its sort of unipolar position wasn't overwhelming and probably was sustainable. And furthermore, I don't know that it's necessarily the case that the United States has gone into economic decline. The U.S. economy has continued to grow and has continued to grow at a fairly decent pace. It's just that the United States has gone into relative decline as other countries, specifically China and India, have been growing very rapidly, 5% a year in India's case, 5 to 7 to 8% in China's case, and other countries like Russia have recovered, right? I mean, Russia was in dire economic straits in the 1990s as the Russian economy sort of reformed and rebuilt itself around oil extraction and export. Russia's economy has rebounded, and so it's not necessarily that the United States has exhausted itself so much as others have gained ground economically. A second process that oftentimes checks unipolarity is balancing, right? That as one country becomes too powerful, it becomes potentially threatening to its neighbors, and its neighbors respond by forming alliances to try to balance or to check that powerful state. In the 1990s, countries that were concerned about the U.S. ascendance and U.S. Dominance, specifically China, Russia, and France, were looking for ways to possibly check the United States, but ultimately concluded that there weren't really very many options to provide any sort of serious counterweight to U.S. power in the world. By the 2000s, however, those countries and others as well, Germany and even Britain, began pursuing what was called at the time soft balancing, in which they weren't trying to compete with the United States or militarily. They weren't trying to be rivals to the United States in a security sense, but they were looking to maybe compete with the United States economically and to constrain or challenge or oppose the United States diplomatically through international organizations and other processes where interests diverged, right? And so it's not a system in which the United States is in undisputed position of power. There's dispute. It just hasn't extended into military balancing, into that kind of pattern. However, in the last couple years, I think we've shifted more to what we would call sort of traditional balancing behavior, where other countries, whether it's China or Russia, have invested in new military capabilities, hypersonic missiles, a renewed investment in nuclear infrastructure, increasingly aggressive military operations on the part of Russia, to potentially serve as military and security counterweights to the United States in the way that we might have seen in the past. And in a sense, I think we might be moving away from that unipolar moment to a system that's much more multipolar, with many different power centers, and no one power center is in a position to dominate the entire international system. The U.S. has responded to this in a couple of different ways over the years, and I'll just sort of run you through three different strategies that we've seen from the three most recent administrations, not counting the Biden administration, which is incoming soon. So the response under the Bush administration, the George W. Bush, was largely spearheaded by a group of foreign policy thinkers, maybe, we'll go with that, known as neocons or neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives sort of mapped out the trends and said the US is growing at 2% a year, China's growing at 10% a year. By about 2020, China is going to be the largest economy in the world. They're going to be militarily on the rise, and it's going to take everything that the United States has to be able to check and counter this growing Chinese power. And that means that the United States has this window where the unipolar moment persists to put the US's global house in order, I guess would be to drain the swamp, I think was the metaphor they used. Essentially identify what are the security concerns the United States has now and aggressively go after those states. So Iraq specifically, but also Iran and Syria and Libya and North Korea were all sort of identified by the neoconservatives as potential flashpoints that the United States had about a decade to resolve. And if the United States couldn't resolve those security concerns for itself within a decade, it wouldn't be able to, because it would take everything the US has to focus on China. The Obama administration took a very different approach. They opted for, I think, more traditional great power balancing rather than looking for military entanglements in other places. The Obama administration worked through its pivot to Asia strategy of trying to build up a system of alliances across Asia, whether it was with, Japan and encouraging Japan to remilitarize, whether it's, deepening security cooperation with Australia, whether it's selling attack submarines to Vietnam, or whether it's reaching out to India and pursuing greater strategic partnerships and cooperation. The essential thinking was that the United States doesn't need to confront China militarily. It needs to do sort of a containment kind of thing, although I don't think that was the language that was used at the time, of essentially making sure that there were partners that the United States could work with if China behaved in an aggressive fashion. The Trump response has been very different from either the Bush administration or the Obama administration. And I think part of that is that the Trump administration is coming in right at that moment where the international system is flipping and China is now the largest economy and in the world. And the Trump response has essentially been to flip the board, that the United States had set up institutions and processes and alliances over the last 100 years, and those had served the US's interests, but the US is no longer in an overwhelmingly dominant position. And so if we upend the entire international system, it's possible that it will land in a way that favors the United States. And maybe one could argue, if you were trying to put a logic to the Trump administration's policy, that it would hurt other countries more than it would hurt the United States. And that would then leave the United States potentially in a position to extend the unipolar moment for a little longer. So again, just three different strategies, all responding to the same problem, which is the international system is turning. The United States is no longer able to dominate the system the way that it has for the past 30 years. And we're trying to figure out what that looks like as things shift and adjust.